Good morning, my friends, and welcome to another time of Wandering Toward Wonder. This is a time each Tuesday that we get to set aside to think about how we're cultivating wonder and joy and deeper spiritual awareness in our lives. Um, my name is Will Ed Green, and I serve as one of the associate pastors and the director of discipleship at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. I see some folks are joining us this morning. I'm so glad to see you as we kind of log on and create some sacred space together. I would love to know where it is you're wandering in from today as we come into this time and as we give folks some more time to join in. So go ahead and sound off in the comments section if you'd like, and let me know where you're wandering in from today. I am here in Nashville, Tennessee, Pastor Casey's home, on my way home to see my family for the first time in a really long time. Now that we're all fully vaccinated and 2 weeks past our shots. So I am excited to be about halfway back to Hope, Arkansas. And again, we'd just love to know where you're joining in from this morning. So please feel free to sound off in the comments so that we kind of know where it is we're wandering in. Hey, Michael, it's good to see you. Glad to know you're back in Arlington for a minute. And welcome to everybody else as well. Normally we end our time with some announcements today. But I want to end a little differently. So let me just share that we've got some really exciting stuff. Hey there, Eddie. It's good to see you today, too. Let me just share some of the exciting things we've got coming up this week at Foundry. So on Sunday, we have our Great Day of Service. That's April 18th. I believe there are still some slots open. You can log into our website using the link that we're going to drop in the comments section now and sign up for that. That's going to be a really great time to volunteer together. Also want to make sure that you've got on your calendar April 25th. That's not this Sunday, but the next Sunday. We'll be celebrating Earth Day at Foundry, and we'll be welcoming a special guest preacher, the Reverend Jenny Phillips, as well as having all kinds of other programming from our green team. And so I really do hope that you will consider signing up for some of that stuff that you'll find on our registrations pages, and that you'll join us on April 25th as we welcome Reverend Phillips. And of course, be sure to keep tuning in each day during the week for our Facebook Lives. All of our pastors are offering devotions daily to help keep us grounded. So we hope you'll receive the gift of that. Hey, Paula and Ann and Mark, it's so good to see y'all today. Thanks for being with me. So I just shared with you that I began a trip home to Arkansas yesterday. I left my condo at 3:30 a.m. To begin driving home. Of course, I had to drive home because I like having my car in case I need to run away for a little bit. And I've been driving through Virginia and Tennessee on my way. And along the way, I passed multiple police officers, sometimes at moments when my foot was feeling a little bit heavier than others, and was struck in light of Daunte Wright's murder on Sunday, was struck again by how completely safe I felt the entire time. I stopped at multiple gas stations that had Trump signs and "Keep God in our guns" posters proudly posted outside their doors, and I never felt unsafe or scared. I never had to worry, not once as I drove that first kind of 9-hour leg, about a police officer pulling me over because I have a rosary, a gift from my mother when I was a kid, hanging from my rearview mirror. Never had to worry about a 23-year veteran of the local police force pulling me over and killing me when they mistook their gun for their taser. And so here we are. Here I am as I sit here, and I kind of am thinking about the fact that two very different situations have occurred. Daunte Wright with his partner simply trying to get his car washed. Me driving home. He wasn't even on a highway. He wasn't traveling far, and yet was murdered just miles from his home. Just 13 miles from a trial currently taking place where another police officer murdered an innocent Black man. My white privilege not only kept me insulated from the terror and trauma so many of my Black and brown siblings have to normalize just to be able to drive to work. And I didn't even have to think about it. It meant that I didn't even have to pay attention to the news about his death if I didn't want to. That white privilege is an invisibility cloak, a blanket that I get to wrap around myself and never have to worry or fear. And I've been thinking about this tension of those two experiences in light of this book that I talked a little bit about on Sunday in my sermon, My Grandmother's Hands. It's written by a social worker named Resmaa Menakem. And he presents in the early chapters of his book this idea of a soul wound. And in his mind, a soul wound is generational trauma like racism or white supremacy or white Christian nationalism that gets passed from one generation to another. And he says that these soul wounds are so deep and they're so pernicious, right? That they write ourselves into our bodies in ways that, for those of us who bear them, we're oftentimes not even consciously aware just how much they are impacting our day-to-day lives. Um, and so, Menachem's idea of these generational soul wounds feels so appropriate for the continuing pandemic of white supremacy that impacts our nation, that impacts our lives, or impacts our lives, as I shared in my case, in ways that aren't necessarily conscious unless we choose to make them conscious. He talks about white supremacy, particularly as a soul wound rooted in hundreds of years of violence against Black and Brown persons, and white supremacy inflicted in both conscious ways and unconscious ways. Um, and I'm mindful, for white folk, that wound is our ability to drive past a police vehicle and not have fear, right? Our ability is to dismiss death, the death of our fellow human beings, with a wave of our hands and an excuse that, oh, well, they had a warrant in the system or they had drugs in their bodies. That wound is written into our bodies in the way that we treat our Black and Brown siblings, the quickness to pull a gun or to pull somebody over because they look a certain way, or rush quickly past somebody in a parking lot, or get anxious in certain neighborhoods past a certain time of night, right? Like all of these things are written into our unconscious operation in the world. And because they're unconscious, because we choose not to surface them, we don't ever have to confront them. And they just kind of perpetuate themselves in our bodies, in the ways we raise our children, in the ways we preach our sermons, in the ways we show up in the workplace. I was visiting with a friend of mine this morning about some of my reflection, and she was sharing some of her experience as a Black woman in our country who's lived through multiple waves, generations of violence, of white supremacist violence. And they shared their lament. She shared her lament, the constant fear that her 13-year-old grandson, who will have his driver's license in 3 years, is an active target for these unconscious soul wounds that so many white folk bear and so many white folk continue inflicting. And the knowledge that she's not able to protect him, right? Once he's got that license. She talked about the fear that her own body wouldn't be treated with respect or care by police or medical care providers if she found herself in an accident or a medical emergency in which she couldn't advocate for herself. And I was just struck again by the fact that while for white folks, our wound is privileged ignorance or whitewashed selective amnesia, right? We get to pick and choose what we see and don't see, what we name and don't name. Even a kind of cursory review of the headlines this morning as I was getting ready to start my day, they don't have Daunte Wright's name in them. A nameless person murdered. Our ability to forget, to not name, to ignore, to dismiss, to minimize is what is for our Black and Brown folk an open wound, a constant open wound in which claiming joy or life is not just a choice, but it's a matter of life or death, because the lament is constant. And it's joy. It's joy they have to work for, she said. In my sermon on Sunday, I talked about Thomas and this encounter that Thomas has with the resurrected Jesus. And I got about a quarter of the way into what I wanted to share on Sunday. It was a profoundly challenging sermon for me to kind of process and write. It could have been a whole sermon series, honest to goodness. But what happens in the story is that Jesus begins his encounters with Mary earlier in the text, right, with the disciples, and then also with Thomas by saying the word peace, peace. Um, and that peace then becomes a window through which people are invited with real compassion and clarity, no judgment on Jesus's part, to look upon the violence and wounds that have been perpetuated or perpetrated rather on his body, a brown skinned Middle Eastern body. And in that confrontation with the wounds that empire had inflicted on it, begin to see the power of the resurrection, which, in my mind, especially right now, is not that our bodies are woundless, that we get to ignore our trauma or forget our trauma, but that our trauma um, is a part of the resurrection life, right? That the gift of resurrection is the promise of life in the midst of and after our trauma and our wounds. And so I wonder, as I sit with all of this, right, the kind of reality of these deep soul wounds that continue to impact in conscious and in unconscious ways our lives, our churches, our homes, our workplaces, our families, um, what kind of peace we're going to be declaring, and what kind of uh, gift we are allowing ourselves to receive from the risen Savior, and we are offering because of that to other people, that we're giving folk in that peace. Jesus's wounds, Jesus's peace become a way for people to name the trauma. And that's the way that healing begins. Jesus's wounds, Jesus's peace becomes a way for people to trust that they can actually say the thing that needs to be said so that the real work of justice can occur, right? If our peace is one that silences protesters or that preferences um, a lack of righteous indignation and response when another person is murdered in our country, another Black person in our country is murdered by white folk, by police officers who are meant to protect them, then that isn't peace. That's not peace. That's not the kind of peace that Jesus is offering in his encounter with Thomas. Um, there's this passage from Jeremiah 6. Some of you may know the prophet Jeremiah, and he's writing at the beginning of his book about the impending destruction of Jerusalem and trying to locate some of why what's happening is happening. And he says this, he says, for from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. And from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. They acted shamefully. They committed an abomination. How are we treating other people's wounds? How is our peace allowing for real healing, or simply plastering over the wounds that have been created, which some of us have inherited from generations of white supremacy and racism? Is our peace an abomination? Or is our peace the same kind of peace that we hear when protesters cry out, no justice, no peace? I'll tell you, thinking about the fact that we're now just about a year out from the murder of George Floyd, I saw more of the kingdom of God. I saw more of the kingdom of God as I knelt in front of Lafayette Plaza outside the White House during those protests a year ago, as protesters cried out, no justice, no peace, than I have in all the sermons and devotions and thoughts and thinking and thoughts and prayers that folk have offered since. Right? There's something about that promise, that call. I apologize for the notifications of no justice, no peace, that refuses to look away from or ignore the trauma. It's a kind of peace that refuses to acquiesce to the powers, to the previous wounds, which drive or demand or encourage us um, to ignore what it is we've done to ourselves, what it is we do to one another, what kind of systems and structures we've created in our world. I wonder if today what Jesus would say to us when he appeared in our midst, in the midst of all the fear and consternation and confusion and anger and anguish, isn't peace, but it's no justice, no peace. If encountering the resurrection for us in this moment is trusting the invitation of the one who went to the cross and the tomb and still bearing the wounds showed up to remind us that real life, resurrection life, means confronting the bad stuff and trusting that when we do, God doesn't leave us to suffer, but God offers us the gift of new life. So that's what I've been thinking about this morning, friends. And I would encourage you to continue asking yourself this question in the coming days and weeks. What kind of peace is it that you and I are offering? What kind of peace is it that we're operationalizing in our churches and small groups and family systems? Because the truth of the matter is, at least in my mind, that wandering toward wonder isn't simply about feeling good. Wandering toward wonder is about creating the kind of spiritual awareness that makes of our lives something that encourages wonder, that allows for an openness to wonder in the life of other people. I want to share a final reflection before we end our time together today that comes from John O'Donohue, a devotionalist. Excuse me, just one second. It's almost time for me to check out, looks like. I want to share a reflection, a blessing from John O'Donohue, who has been kind of a spiritual mentor and prophet for me during this Lenten season. It's called For One Who is Exhausted. It's been for me one of those things that I return to again and again as I think about the continuing need for all this work. And I hope that maybe it will be a blessing for you. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unattended stress falls in on the mind like an increasing, endless weight. The light in the mind becomes dim, and things you could take in stride before now become laborsome events of will. Weariness invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. When something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. It's now you've been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There's nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you have forsaken in the race of days. At first, your thinking will darken and sadness will take over like listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You've traveled too far over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. So take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the way of rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. And gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. Friends, I wish you peace on this day, the kind of real peace, true peace that Jesus offers, peace to do the hard work, peace to trust that you don't have to do it alone, and peace to know that along the way, when you feel like you do, by golly, you've got a community at Foundry that loves you, absolutely, that's got your back. and we'll walk with you, we'll journey with you every step of the way. Remember, be excessively gentle with yourselves and keep on wandering towards wonder. Till next time, bye-bye.